Hi there, and welcome back to the Warlock's Tower. Today I'm going to do another Ninth Age path guide. So we're going to look at the path of evocation today. This is partly because it's essentially the next lore I've played with. So I've used my vampires counts, Vampire Covenants army with these lore, and yeah, it's pretty good. It's certainly got some applications. Again, I think as with most of the paths, I think you need to choose the path to suit your army or vice versa, and that will give you easily the best use out of it. So, to look at evocation, there's a very obvious place to start, and that's with the spell Evocation of Souls. So, being a trait spell, this is really useful, makes the lore significantly better all by itself. So, basically, as I'm sure you know, if you've got a level 1, they know 2 spells, and as I mentioned in my divination video, I think one of the big changes from 8th edition Magic, which I'm used to 9th Age Magic, is the fact that casters know so few spells, it makes it really hard to get that range of spells. And this is a freebie. You get one more spell for knowing evocation than a lot of the other paths. Now, that only helps if it's a useful spell, and it really has two different functions depending on what army you're playing. So the first, and I suspect the most common use of it, will be if you're playing an undead army. So if you've come out of the tombs, or if you've come out of the graves, you'd be almost always targeting a unit with an evoked value. Now this is if you target any one model with an evoked value. So even if you've got an aura and it targets 10 units and 9 of them don't have an evoked value, it will just kick into this effect. So if this targets a single character inside the target unit, or it raises a number of runes as stated on the evoked profile, it affects either a target unit or a character within the target unit. So it's interesting to my mind, the way I've read it. If you cast it as an aura and say you set affect 3 or 4 units, it could be that you choose to use the evoked value for one of the units and then one of the characters in another unit. Say you've got Necromancer who's taken a wound in one unit, but you've got a unit of skeletons that taken 10 wounds. Maybe the Necromancer in the zombie unit you choose to affect the character, but in the skeleton unit you affect the unit itself. So you can either do the character in a character in the unit, or you can do the unit itself. Either way, they need to have an evoked value, and as you'll see from the army books of the relevant troops, that will determine how much they're raising. So, for example, if we go to the vampire counts and we look at the evoked value of dire wolves, they got D3 plus 4, so they will gain D3 plus 4 wounds back into that unit. So that's pretty useful, and I think that's going to be a lot of what you see evocation of souls used for in undead armies, and therefore I think more often than not you're going to see the evocation path taken by those armies as their almost their default. I imagine some of the armies will make use of it because it does have some pretty nice spells. Characters and models with Terran presence cannot raise more than 2 wounds from this spell in a single magic phase. So even with multiple castings, so that might affect how you cast it and the order of which you cast your evocation of souls. So it's really a spell where you're talking about priorities, and conversely, if you're playing against evocation, you're talking about when do you want to use your dispel dice, when do you want to use your dispel scroll, because those little differences just make a huge change with this spell. You can cast it in a number of ways. Gives a really quite big use of 18 inches for an augment. That's pretty good. A 6-inch bubble or a 12-inch bubble, which is huge. I really like the idea of using this with a Nosferatu vampire who can add plus 3 inches to that. So that's a 15-inch aura. Okay, you're not necessarily wanting a weak vampire like a Nosferatu vampire running into the middle of the board, but yeah, we'll talk about how vampires can use it, but that appeals to me a lot. The alternate use of evocation of souls is if you don't have any models with evoked values, so this would be particularly useful to my mind on skinks, use your Quaffle Lord to cast it. Every unit within 6 inches of the target is at -1 leadership. That's when you're taking the leadership test. So even if you cast it and then later on move within 6, or if you cast it and then they subsequently charge you, they'll be at -1 leadership. Now that's on top of the -1 leadership that comes from fear. So if you've got a big skink cohort, you could cast this on them, and then somebody charges them. If you manage to win, or if at the start of combat they take their fear test, say they leadership 9, that drops them to 7 because fear and the evoke rule. That could well mean that they are failing their test. If they're a leadership 8 units, they go down to leadership 6. They're better than 50-50 to fail that test, and suddenly your skinks are hitting them on 3s. That's going to be like a huge swing in that combat. Equally, you could cast it knowing that you might win combat. That's a big swing as well, -2 effectively. So yeah, great actual spell there. So the trait spell works really well for both the evoked value and the non-evoked value. So a great freebie from the evoked path. The next spell, spell 1, is the Spectral Blade. So this can be cast on a 5+ or on a 10+. The 5+ spell gives the target unit rerolls to wound in combat, and the 10+ gives them lethal strike. Now, it depends on the situation, what the combat's like, but if you have a unit which comes with lethal strike as basic, so Graveguard particularly, this is a great spell because it gives them that reroll only on a 5+. It's an 18-inch range, which for augments is a good range. So that's a great thing. So you've got a doubles your chances of popping a 6. I'm even tempted to take Graveguard just with hand weapons, just so that it sounds daft, but they're less likely to pass when they're rolling to wound, less likely to wound successfully. So you get that reroll, you get another go at 6. If they're wounding on 2s, you're not going to get the 6s all that often. If they're wounding on 4s, you're going to get a second chance at the 6 reasonably frequently. The other alternative is you go for lethal strike. So particularly if you've got a unit that are putting out a heap of attacks, if they're likely to hit for whatever reason, high weapon skill, obviously obvious reason, or lightning strike, lightning reflexes, then they're very likely to hit, and then that gives you a lot of chances to pop that 6 and get lethal strike. So in some respects, I like the 5+ spell better. It gives you a really good chance of getting that to wound roll off. The next spell is Dance Macabre, on either a 6+ for a 12-inch range, or an 11+ for a 12-inch aura. Now, this allows you to make an 8-inch magical move, and you have the ethereal special rule during that move. Now, the ethereal bit is pretty unlikely to come into effect. It's pretty situational. If you've got a huge move, ethereal is really useful because you can zoom through terrain. If you've got anything but a small single model, you're not going to get the back of a unit out of a piece of terrain. I guess it stops you taking dangerous terrain tests, but it's not likely to have a huge effect. So the key points to note with a magical move, it's moving as if you're in the remaining move subphase. So there's no charging, unfortunately, and there's no marching is another key rule. So you can't double this to a 16-inch move, fantastic though that would be. So it really, to my mind, has two functions. I think the key thing to remember though is don't rely on this spell. If you can almost get a unit out of charge arc, don't rely on getting a 6+ spell just to sneak them out, because your opponent will save his scroll or his dice for that, and that can really swing a game. So I think it's always that odd thing that you don't want to rely on this movement, but it can be really useful. I think it really works well with Wraiths and Hex Wraiths that you can go back through and do another sweeping attack, so that's a really useful way of using it. It's only a 12-inch move, so a 12-inch range, so that's kind of doesn't make that useful for that. But light troops, etc., you've still got the remaining moves, subphase, special rules. So you can reform if you've got light troops, etc. So it can be useful from that point. But I think it's actually Danse Macabre has been before in other editions a really useful spell, but I think it's less useful. I can certainly see it with a really aggressive combat army, the 12-inch aura, really getting the army across the table really fast, and I'll talk a bit about that in the end of this, and how to design an army to work really well with lots of evocation wizards. The next spell is Ancestral Aid. So this is a 12-inch range, and it's a 7+ or 9+, and it's quite a difference between the two, although probably not terribly useful to boost these spells in most situations. The target must re-roll failed to hit rolls with its close combat attacks, and then on a 9+, it's not a great deal more. You get to re-roll your shooting attacks. So this could be where a Lizardman taking this on a slam allows him to re-roll his shooting attacks and just going again for those sixes. So a blowpipe unit, you put out 20 blowpipe shots or 20 poison javelin shots, you get 2 goes at getting those sixes. So that could be really useful. Obviously, the other use would be in a Tomb King army that they can re-roll to hit with those shooting attacks with their war machines and with their bows. That's a great use for that. And only in 9+, it's not a huge amount extra. So good spell for those guys. From a vampire count point of view, certainly the fail to hit rolls is great because you've got heaps of potential to get poison attacks with those ghouls and those crypt horrors. So to hit rolls are really key. You've generally got a low weapon skill army, so it allows you to compensate for that weapon skill failing and get those hits in, but with poison on top of that, again, similar to intentionally taking a low strength so you can get those lethal strikes in with reroll, potentially having a low weapon skill is pretty good because you get that second go at getting the 6 when you're rerolling to hit. If you've got a shooty army, again, I could certainly see a big block of shooting if you're taking evocation, because rerolling to shoot, yeah, you can't do an aura with this spell, so having all your shooters in one place is really useful. So 9+, I think that's a great use of that spell. The last one turn as well is really useful for skinks, because if you've got you move up, you cast this spell, they re-roll to shoot, obviously in their shooting phase, trying to get those poison shots. Then they get charged, they get to re-roll those shooting attacks on the standard shoot as well and get another go at popping off a few poison wounds. That can make a huge difference. So I can actually see this law on a slam, Quattle Lord as is. So yeah, that would be pretty cool use of that. Next spell is Touch the Reaper. Now this is an interesting direct damage spell. Target suffers D3 hits with Strength 10 and Armor Piercing 6. When rolling to wound with this attack, use the opponent's leadership instead of the toughness. So most of the times you're still going to be hitting, wounding on 3s. Obviously leadership 9 and 10 goes 3s and 4s. So it's kind of almost like hitting them with a mini cannonball or a slightly weird cannonball. But either a 7+ for a 12-inch range is a bit short, but if you've got a combat vampire running around, that's pretty doable. Or a 24-inch range on a 10+, that's a useful spell. It's going to scare things. Monsters running at you, especially relatively low leadership ones. So hero mounted on monsters, that's gonna scare those guys. It also mitigates that chance of popping a 1 with the cannonball when you're rolling to wound, because rather than being 1 hit with D3 wounds, it's D3 hits each at strength 10. So yeah, rolling against leadership is obviously significantly worse than rolling against the toughness, but most of the time you're going to be winning on 2s anyway. So I can see this being a really useful spell 10 plus is a decent amount to cast it, but it's not that difficult. I mean, to my mind, you almost want to keep this on a cheap low level caster and chuck the dice at it, and if you blow them up, but you take the monster with you, then great. But yeah, it's a shame it can't be boosted to D6 hits. That would be a really scary spell, and then that would really be worth chucking big dice at to pile it through with your low level caster. But it's a good spell nonetheless. Whisper of the Veil. Target suffers -1 leadership, -2 weapon skill to a minimum of 1. But a 9 plus, this is a 24-inch range. Again, this works really well with your undead armies. So often they're struggling to hit opponents because of their low weapon skill, and that's a really big problem. You're often hitting on 4s, even 5s, obviously with zombies and such. So dropping the weapon skill is such an important factor. It also, almost with all undead armies, it gives you 2 bites of the cherry, because not only are you dropping their weapon skill automatically, but potentially you're increasing the chances of them failing that fear test. So, as it says, it doesn't stack with the evocation spell, but if they're causing fear anyway, they're -2 leadership when they're taking their fear test, potentially dropping them to weapon skill 1 while boosting you up with 2 weapon skill. So potentially it swings massively that zombies have got 2 chances. If they're fighting something weapon skill 3, it gives you 2 chances to bring them down to the same weapon skill. So it's a great spell from that point of view. And obviously, if you drop their weapon skill, which swings the combat in your favour, then you've just increased your chances of breaking that combat. So yeah, a good spell again. It's gonna scare people. It's gonna make a big difference in a lot of combats. So it's another way of swinging combats. It's got 24-inch range, so you're going to be covering most of the board with that if you're standing in the middle. That to me is a really good spell, and it's only a 9 plus. It's 3 dice to cast. Okay, it's not brilliant if you miscast with 3 dice, but it's not the end of the world. And to my mind, yeah, it allows you to win that combat, and then it gives you a better chance of breaking the unit in combat as well. So yeah, really useful spell. If you can combine that, I mean, yeah, if you get really lucky, and there's ways to boost your chances of casting with both Tomb Kings and vampires. If you can combine that with one of the other buffs, even as a threat, so not aiming, well, hoping obviously to cast them both, but you can have, okay, which one are you going to stop with your dice? Are you going to stop Whispers of the Veil, or are you going to stop Spectral Blades or Ancestral Aid? They're all reasonably cheap to cast, so your opponent, it gives them that difficult decision. Do they try and keep their dice, and with presumably less dice than you've got, try and get through high rolls to stop you casting these spells, or are they going to just save all their dice and just get rid of Whispers of the Veil and let the other spells through? So just the range of buffs, and all being quite useful buffs and hexes for combat, it's really useful. So it's a great spell. So the last spell, spell 6, Hasten the Hour. Again, an interesting spell. This reminds me of the spell at the end of Divination, because it has an anti-Death Star feel to it. So you choose up to 3 different models in the target unit, which may be characters or champions. Each suffers 1 hit, which automatically wounds and has armor piercing 6. So this allows you to just chip away at characters. An 18-inch range is pretty good. It allows you to sit away from a bunker. So if we go back to my previous video, if someone's gone for a conclave of divination wizards and they usually stick them in 1 bunker, you can try and kill all 3 wizards in turn 2, turn 3, chip away, make them scared, make them worry that they're gonna take out all their characters in one go. It might force them to change their plan and split up their characters, which they wouldn't normally do. I know when I played James with my vampires, this spellcast scared him, and with the way targeting rules works, potentially it forces them to, if they've just got one infantry bunker with all their wizards in it, where do they put those infantry models so that you could then target them with shooting, because they have to go into their other cavalry units, or vice versa. So yeah, I think that's a really nasty spell. Reasonably high casting value on 12 plus, but if you've got that spell and it forces them to play in a different way, it's doing its job even without being cast. So you roll that 6 spell, they split up their death style, which would have rolled over your unit, smashed in the face, and taken off all your toys. But because they've only got one character in it rather than 3 fighting characters, it's much better, much more manageable. So yeah, I think that's a really good spell. I think it's really, really going to worry people. So yeah, I like that spell, and I like that spell, as I say, not just to cast it, but to threaten opponents with it. So I think the oddity with evocation compared with a lot of the other laws is you're quite often going to take multiple casters on evocation, just because of the functionality of raising back models. Obviously, this is with particularly undead armies. So I think you're going to see quite often where people have 3 or 4, even more, of the spells from evocation, just because the nature of taking 2 or 3 cheap wizards to try and power through evocation of souls so that they can boost up their armies. I really like this law. I'm currently in the process of working out how to build a unit of Graveguard, so that I can take a Nosferatu vampire caster sitting behind that, possibly even 2, one with the ability to avoid miscast from big dice spells and take a dice out of it when I cast, and one with the ability to boost the range on those spells, and particularly on the aura version of these spells. So that would work in a similar way to an 8th edition army I used quite a lot. How it worked within tournaments was I'd have very solid units at the front. In that case, I tended to use Crypt Horrors and a Ghoul unit, and they'd sit at the front and act as a shield. So anyone who charges has to go into those Crypt Horrors. Crypt Horrors would hopefully grind them out, and that would be a great way of playing an army. Now, the problem with Crypt Horrors was that they didn't cope very well with high armor values. Well, Evocation now has a solution to that. You can give them Lethal Strike. Brilliant. That means that if you've got poor armor values fighting you, you've got a load of foot elves running at you, infantry elves running at you, you can do the Spectral Blades rerolls to wound and poison them to death. If you had a load of knights come in, a load of elite troops with 2+ or God forbid 1+ saves comes in, you can step it up a gear and go to the Lethal Strike version of Spectral Blades. With that amount of attacks coming out, that's going to be brilliant. So I can really see that as a potential way of using this spell. Again, if I can get a big unit of Graveguard together, similar process. Basically, sit your cheap zombie units behind with some evocation wizards in, and cast evocation to really boost up the Graveguard unit, to really keep them coming back, pun intended, from the grave, or reroll to wound, reroll to hit. Sit with those combat buffs behind your units, just making them much, much more effective. So the 2 problems really with this type of list, which is fairly defensive, so as I say, you sit with your wizards behind a shield of grindy, solid units, is that basically they can sit off you, and that causes a problem for 2 reasons. One is the very short, or the generally short range of evocation spells. So as I say, it's hard to reach out and do large amounts of damage with evocation. It's 18-inch range. It's there's only two missiles, so it could be worth taking a caster on another lore just to try and kill some chaff. There's no great sort of fireball type spell where you can just go and blast away a cheap unit. It's either the expensive Touch of the Reaper or Hasten the Hour, and they're really just chipping away. They're not blasting through. They're killing expensive elite models. It's not designed for killing 10 skinks or 5 fast cav models. So that can be a problem. That said, it can still be worth casting Whisper of Bales, get that -1 leadership. It can mean that your Terrorgeist or Shrieking Horror is leaping forward and doing an extra couple of wounds because of the -1 leadership. If you're able to raise above your starting level, a starting number, it can be worth casting Evocation early. But I do find that if you've just got Evocation, it could be early doors, it could be difficult to tempt out a scroll from your opponent because if they don't have a Death Star and put all their models in one unit and you can scare them with Haste in the Hour, or if they don't have a monster and you can scare them with Touch of the Reaper, then it's hard to draw that scroll out. So it could be worth having a wizard with a more of a ranged ability just to try and draw the scrolls early. The other alternative to that is I find that armies with ranged firepower are generally quite scary to that slow moving heavy and the infantry units that works really well. But that said, you've suddenly got Danse Macabre, and the fact you can 12-inch bubble that on only an 11, what I would do would be to move up my full movement, but so I stayed in coherency, so that it's still, although say Crypt Horrors move faster than Barrowguard, Graveguard, you wouldn't max move with the Crypt Horror, so that it keeps a front line so that you can't be hit in the flank. And you move up and threaten people shooters. But with an 8-inch magical move, for pretty much a whole army in that situation, you're going to shove forward, hopefully keep some bat swarms nearby to redirect them, and really put pressure on early. So if you've got, say, a Sylvaneth army who are going to sit back and shoot you off with their bows, you can max move forward and then move forward that other 8 inches, and they then have a choice. If you can work it that it's on a low level caster, you can big dice it and they get that choice of do they scroll it or do they let you move all of your units right in their face, turn 1 even. Okay, you're likely to get charged, but you're being charged by archers with combat units, so do you care? The only thing to watch out for with that is if they've got a lot of light infantry and fast cavalry, they can skirt around you and start shooting you in the back of the head. So make sure you understand how their army works and compensate for that. The other thing I think is a really great thing to use if you're using Vampire Counts and Evocational is a Cadaver Wagon. I think the potential for this to just give you effectively free boosts and without too much effort. It is 220 points. It doesn't do an awful lot else. Don't expect it to smash in and do a ton of damage in combat. It's only weapon skill 1 with the majority of its attacks and only strength 4 with its impact hits. The good thing is it can be made into a wall platform and made more survivable, but the key things are it has the Wake the Dead, brilliant name for a rule. If you cast any spell from Evocation, if you're within 12 inches of the Cadaver Wagon, select a unit within 6 inches of the Cadaver Wagon, and it gets lightning reflexes. Fantastic. As I say, a lot of your units are low weapon skill, and that can just boost them up, make them hit harder or hit more frequently, and that allows them to hit harder. On top of that, bring out your dead. If you cast Evocation of Souls, and if you're within 6 inches, everyone it affects, if you're standard height, it's +2 on the evoked roll. If you're large height, +1. So this is why I'm looking at Beauregard, because then you're raising back D3 +6, and that works every time you use Evocation of Souls. So if you're you've got 4 or 5 wizards who have Evocation of Souls, you can sit there and cast away, just small dice it, get those rolls in, and every time you get a free +2 on that castle value, and therefore getting D3 +6, Beauregard get back. So that's going to replenish that unit. Say you get smashed into by a load of knights, some brave person charges your lethal strike with their knights and take you down to 2 models from your 20. Well, you can cast twice, and each time you should average putting 8 models back into the unit. That's fantastic. And then after you've put those 8 models back into the unit each time, those guys have got lightning reflexes. So it really can swing a combat from one you look destined to lose to one you're almost certain to win. So it's a great combination of spells. So yeah, I like Evocation Lore. It's a good lore. I don't think it solves all your problems, but if you can build your army around it, then it can go a long way. I think it's one of those lores that it could be worth piling a lot of points into, and yeah, trying to get units that work together and it allows them to be supported by that magic lore and actually build your tactics around magic. Whereas I think a lot of the times I look at armies and I think, yeah, I'll take that path and hope to cast some spells from it, but I'm not banking on it. But I think it's certainly worth give yourself a good chance of channeling with 3 or 4 wizards, and give yourself a good chance of getting most of the spells in the path, because they're all good spells. And yeah, maybe have one caster who you roll late, but the difficulty with Evocation is there's no spell to drop to. So if you roll early and get a spell you don't want, you can't drop it out for an attribute spell. So it is a bit of an interesting one how you decide the order for which you cast your spells, sort your spells. But it's a good lore, and I look forward to using it in the future. And certainly stay subscribed so you can watch some battle reports, particularly with my vampire counts using Evocation. Anyway, goodbye from the Warlock's Tower. I hope you've enjoyed this. Feel free to comment in the comment section or email me through our website. Thanks then. Bye.